Loyalty isn't just a word. It's a heartbeat at the end of a leash when the rest of the world has locked its doors. When a discarded veteran and his German shepherd were pushed into the freezing rain, they didn't find an end. They found a secret buried in stone. Rain hammered against the cracked leather of Sullivan's boots, soaking through the worn stitching in seconds. He stood at the end of the asphalt driveway, water running down the collar of his surplus jacket, watching the heavy mahogany door close. The click of the deadbolt sounded louder than the thunder overhead. It was a sharp, final sound. 30 years of his life, wiped out by a judge's gavel, a mountain of obscure debt, and an ex-wife who knew a far better lawyer. He had nothing left, no bank account, no truck keys in his pocket, no roof, just the damp clothes clinging to his back, a canvas duffel bag cutting into his collarbone, and a thick nylon leash wrapped around his frozen left hand. Sarge whined, a low, rumbling vibration in the back of his throat. The German shepherd pressed his 80-pound frame against Sullivan's leg, offering the only warmth left in the county. "I know, buddy," Sullivan muttered, his voice raspy from a cold that was already taking root in his chest. "I know." He turned his back on the house he had built with his own hands. The suburban street was painfully quiet. It was the specific kind of quiet that meant people were watching from behind their drawn curtains, sipping hot coffee, silently relieved it was him standing out in the deluge, and not them. Sullivan didn't give his former neighbors the satisfaction of a backward glance. He simply adjusted the strap of his duffel and started walking. The shrapnel ache in his right knee flared with his very first step. It was a dull, rhythmic throb that kept perfect time with the storm, a lingering souvenir from a dusty road in a country most people couldn't point to on a map. He had spent years choking on sand for a nation that thanked him with a plastic medal and a mountain of red tape. Now he was 52, broken down and homeless in the middle of a Pennsylvania November. They walked for hours. The highway shoulder was a treacherous slurry of mud and broken glass. Semi-trucks roared past, throwing sheets of dirty water over them. Sullivan kept himself positioned between the traffic and the dog. Sarge walked perfectly at heel, his head down, ears pinned back against the driving rain. The dog didn't complain. He just stayed glued to Sullivan's side, bound by a loyalty that humans had entirely forgotten how to practice. By late afternoon, the temperature plummeted. The rain turned into sharp, stinging sleet. Sullivan's jacket was completely compromised. The cold was sinking into his bones, slowing his heart rate, numbing his fingers until he couldn't feel the leash anymore. He had to loop it around his wrist to make sure he didn't drop it. "We need to get off the road," Sullivan said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He stopped and scanned the tree line. Just beyond the rusted guardrail, the dense woods of the Appalachian foothills rose sharply into the fog. Sullivan remembered these woods from when he was a teenager. There used to be an old logging road that cut through the valley, long abandoned before he was even born. It was dangerous to go into the woods in a storm, but staying on the exposed highway as night fell was a guaranteed death sentence. Exposure didn't care if you were a veteran. It just put you to sleep. They breached the tree line, fighting through thick briars that tore at Sullivan's canvas bag. The canopy of dead oaks offered a slight reprieve from the sleet, but the ground was a treacherous soup of dead leaves and freezing mud. Sullivan slipped twice, barking his shin hard against a hidden rock, but Sarge was always right there, pushing his solid shoulder against the man's chest to help him back up. Twilight bled the last of the gray light from the sky. Panic, cold and sharp, began to edge its way into Sullivan's rational mind. He needed shelter, a rock overhang, a hollowed tree, anything. Then Sarge stopped dead. The shepherd's ears snapped forward. He let out a sharp, singular bark. "What is it?" Sullivan asked, squinting through the gloom. Sarge pulled against the leash, dragging Sullivan off the faint deer trail they had been following. They crested a small, rocky ridge. Below them, heavily camouflaged by decades of overgrown ivy and skeletal vines, sat a structure. It wasn't a cabin. It was made entirely of field stone, its roof long gone, its wooden beams collapsed inward like the ribs of a decaying beast. But the four thick walls were still standing, and one corner was mostly covered by a massive fallen slate slab that had once been part of a chimney. It was a ruin, a forgotten remnant of the 1800s. To Sullivan, it was a palace. He scrambled down the embankment, Sarge leading the way. They ducked under the slate slab. Inside it was dry. The air smelled of ancient dust and dry earth, entirely untouched by the storm raging outside. Sullivan dropped his duffel bag. It hit the ground with a dull thud. He collapsed against the cold stone wall, sliding down until he hit the dirt floor. His chest heaved. His hands shook violently. Sarge immediately stepped into the space between Sullivan's outstretched legs, curled himself into a tight ball, and rested his heavy head on Sullivan's chest. The heat radiating from the dog was immediate. Sullivan wrapped his freezing arms around the shepherd, burying his face in the coarse, wet fur. He didn't cry. He was too tired, too hollowed out for tears. He just closed his eyes and listened to the sleet battering the stone above them, grateful for one more night of breathing. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a dull, gray thinning of the dark. Sullivan woke shivering violently, his teeth clicking together in a rapid, uncontrollable rhythm. His entire right side felt paralyzed from sleeping on the hard earth, and his bad knee throbbed with a sickening intensity. Well, Sarge was no longer sleeping on his chest. Sullivan opened his eyes, blinking away the crust of sleep. The sleet had stopped, replaced by a dense, freezing fog that rolled through the open top of the stone ruins like smoke. "Sarge," Sullivan rasped. His throat felt like it was lined with sandpaper. The dog was standing in the far corner of the ruined foundation. He wasn't stretching or looking for a way out. His nose was pressed firmly into a gap where the massive stone hearth met the decaying remains of a wooden floorboard. Most of the floor in the ruin was just packed dirt, but near the fireplace, a few heavy oak planks had miraculously survived the decades of rot. Sarge took a deep, forceful sniff. He snorted, a sharp exhalation of air, and then he began to dig. His heavy black claws tore into the water-softened wood, sending wet splinters flying backward over his haunches. He whined, a high-pitched sound of intense frustration, and started biting at the edge of the plank, trying to rip it up with his teeth. "Hey, knock it off," Sullivan groaned, pushing himself up. His joints screamed in protest. He leaned against the stone wall for balance. "There's nothing under there but rats and worms. Leave it." Sarge ignored him completely. This was highly unusual. The dog was trained to the highest standard. A single command usually stopped him dead in his tracks. But now, Sarge was frantic. He managed to hook his jaw under a splintered edge of the oak board and pulled backward with all his 80 pounds of muscle. A loud crack echoed in the small stone space. A piece of the wood snapped off. Sarge spat it out and went right back to digging at the dirt beneath it. Curiosity finally broke through Sullivan's miserable cold. He limped over to the hearth, rubbing his frozen hands together. He knelt beside the dog, wincing as his knee popped. "Move," Sullivan said gently, nudging Sarge with his shoulder. The dog stepped back, panting heavily, but kept his eyes locked on the hole he had created. Sullivan peered down. The wood was rotten, but underneath it wasn't just packed earth. It was something flat, something unnatural. He reached into the damp hole and scraped away the dirt with his raw, freezing fingers. His fingernails caught on an edge. It was a piece of metal, specifically a heavy iron ring, deeply pitted with rust, resting flat against a square wooden hatch that had been concealed beneath the oak floorboards. Sullivan stopped breathing for a second. His cynical mind immediately tried to rationalize it. A root cellar, a septic cover, an old well. But the way it was hidden, the secondary floorboards placed deliberately over the hatch, spoke of intention. It spoke of concealment. "What did you find, buddy?" Sullivan whispered. He needed leverage. He looked around the ruins, finally spotting a rusted, heavy iron fireplace poker, half buried in the old hearth ashes. He pulled it free, wiped the grim off on his pants, and wedged the heavy iron tip beneath the edge of the trapdoor. He pushed down on the poker. It didn't budge. Decades of swollen wood and rusted hinges fought against him. Sullivan adjusted his grip. He placed his bad knee directly on the floor to brace himself, ignoring the shooting pain, and threw his entire upper body weight onto the makeshift lever. He gritted his teeth, letting out a guttural sound of exertion. With a sickening screech of ancient, oxidized metal, the trapdoor broke its seal. A rush of air blew up from the darkness below. It didn't smell like rot or stagnant water. It smelled dry, incredibly dry, carrying the faint, metallic scent of gun oil and old canvas. Sullivan grabbed the iron ring with both hands and heaved. The heavy wooden hatch flipped over on its rusted hinges, slamming against the stone hearth with a loud bang that sent a flock of unseen birds scattering from the trees outside. He stared down into the black square. It was pitch dark. Sarge stepped up to the edge, sniffed the darkness, and let out a single, low woof. Sullivan unzipped the front pocket of his duffel bag and pulled out his tactical flashlight. It was heavy, military issue, one of the few things he had refused to leave behind. He clicked it on. The harsh, white LED beam cut through the gloom like a knife. He pointed it down the hole. There was a ladder. It wasn't made of wood. It was heavy steel rungs set directly into a shaft of poured concrete. This wasn't a 19th century root cellar. This was modern, built during the Cold War, or maybe even later. The beam of light reached the bottom, about 15 feet down, illuminating a heavy steel door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Sullivan's heart began to hammer in his chest. His ex-wife taking his house, the miserable walk in the rain, the bone-deep cold, it all faded into the background. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his system. He looked at Sarge. The dog sat back on his haunches, staring at Sullivan with intelligent, expectant eyes. "Well," Sullivan said softly, sliding his flashlight into his jacket pocket, "we don't have anywhere else to be." He turned around, grasped the freezing steel rungs of the ladder, and began to climb down into the earth. 15 feet of vertical descent felt like a mile to a man with a shattered knee. Sullivan's boots hit the solid concrete floor of the shaft with a heavy thud. Pain radiated up his right leg, a jagged spike that made his vision blur for a fraction of a second. He gripped the freezing steel ladder, panting, letting the flare of agony subside into a dull, manageable throb. Above him, the square of gray light was broken by the silhouette of the German shepherd. Sarge let out a high, distressed whine. "Stay put," Sullivan echoed up the shaft. His voice bounced off the concrete, sounding hollow and metallic. He unclipped the heavy tactical flashlight from his jacket pocket and swept the beam across his immediate surroundings. The shaft ended in a small, claustrophobic vestibule. In front of him stood the steel door. It was a serious piece of hardware, painted a faded battleship gray, flaking with rust around the edges. A large circular locking wheel sat dead center, resembling the bulkhead hatch of a decommissioned submarine. Sullivan stepped up to it and grabbed the wheel. He threw his weight to the left. The metal didn't even groan. It was fused solid by decades of dampness and neglect. He cursed softly, stepping back. He needed leverage, but more immediately, he needed his dog. The freezing fog was settling into the ruins above, and Sarge was exposed. Sullivan holstered the flashlight and began the grueling climb back up the ladder. Every step was a negotiation with his ruined cartilage. When he breached the surface, the sleet had transitioned into a fine, stinging snow. Sarge was pacing the perimeter of the hatch, his thick tail tucked low. "All right, buddy, you're not going to like this," Sullivan muttered, kneeling in the dirt. He unzipped his canvas duffel bag and dumped the meager contents onto the dry floorboards. A spare pair of wool socks, a rusted shaving kit, 3 crushed protein bars, and a rolled-up tarp. He took the heavy canvas bag and inspected the reinforced stitching on the handles. It was military surplus, built to take a beating. Sullivan grabbed Sarge by the collar and pulled the dog close. He unclipped the heavy nylon leash, looped it through the handles of the duffel bag, and secured it with a series of tight half-hitches. Then he guided the shepherd's front legs into the bag, pulling the thick canvas up around the dog's chest like a makeshift climbing harness. Sarge froze, entirely confused, but his training held. He didn't fight. "Good boy," Sullivan breathed, patting the dog's head. Now comes the hard part. He braced his good leg against the iron ring of the hatch. Wrapping the other end of the nylon leash securely around his forearms, he slowly pushed Sarge over the edge. The dog let out a short yelp as his 80 pounds of dead weight dropped, fully suspended by the canvas bag. Sullivan's shoulders screamed as the leash dug viciously into his forearms. Hand over hand, gritting his teeth against the burning friction, he lowered the shepherd down the concrete tube. When the tension finally slacked, Sullivan leaned over the edge. Sarge had wriggled out of the bag and was shaking himself off on the vestibule floor. Sullivan climbed down for the second time, his muscles trembling from the exertion. Down in the hole, the ambient temperature was at least 20 degrees warmer than the frozen woods above, but it was still bitterly cold. They needed to get past the door. He retrieved the rusted iron fireplace poker he had dropped earlier. Sliding the thick iron rod between the spokes of the locking wheel, Sullivan created a rudimentary breaker bar. He braced his boots against the concrete wall, gripped the ends of the poker, and pulled. For 10 seconds, nothing happened. The veins in Sullivan's neck bulged. His breathing turned into a ragged guttural growl. Crack! A sound like a gunshot echoed in the tight space. The rust seal broke. The wheel jerked counterclockwise. Sullivan discarded the bent poker and grabbed the wheel with both hands, spinning it rapidly. Heavy locking bolts retracted inside the steel frame with a series of deep, satisfying clunks. He grabbed the heavy latch handle and pulled backward. The heavy hinges shrieked in protest, but the door swung open, kicking up a thick cloud of stagnant dust. He drew his flashlight and pointed it into the void. The beam cut through the particulate matter, illuminating a space that defied logic. It wasn't a dirt-walled root cellar, it was a poured concrete bunker, roughly 20 by 20 feet. The walls were lined with heavy industrial shelving. Sullivan stepped over the threshold, Sarge shadowing his boots closely. The air inside was completely still, carrying a strange, synthetic scent of cured rubber, gun oil, and old paper. He swept the light across the shelves. Hundreds of canned goods sat in neat rows, their labels long disintegrated into gray mush, the metals swollen and heavily oxidized. A complete loss. But below the food, stacked on heavy wooden pallets, were rows of airtight military-grade storage lockers. In the center of the room sat a heavy oak table. On it rested a shortwave radio setup, coated in a thick layer of dust, flanked by 3 pressurized kerosene lanterns. Someone was waiting for the end of the world, Sullivan whispered. He walked over to the table, wiping away the grime from one of the lanterns. It was heavy. He shook it gently. Liquid sloshed inside. Fuel. Digging into his wet jacket pocket, he produced a battered brass Zippo. He popped the chimney off the lantern, turned the gas valve, and struck the flint. The wick caught instantly, bathing the concrete room in a warm, flickering amber glow. He lit the second and the third. The heat, radiating from the glass chimneys, was immediate. Sullivan clicked off his flashlight and dropped onto a heavy wooden folding chair sitting beside the table. He was utterly exhausted. Sarge began to meticulously sniff the perimeter of the room, his nose tracing the seam where the concrete floor met the wall. The dog wasn't interested in the rusted cans. He bypassed the sleeping cots tucked in the corner. He stopped dead in front of a heavy, olive-drab footlocker shoved beneath the bottom shelf of the far wall. He looked back at Sullivan and let out a soft, inquiring whine. Sullivan pushed himself out of the chair. The bunker had provided shelter and warmth, but if he was going to survive the winter, he needed something far more substantial than kerosene and expired beans. He walked over to the locker, knelt down, and reached for the heavy steel latches. Cold steel met Sullivan's raw fingers. The latches on the olive-drab footlocker were thick, over-engineered pieces of hardware designed to survive an artillery strike. Unlike the submarine door, they weren't rusted shut. A thick bead of hardened, yellowed grease coated the hinges, applied meticulously by someone who understood the slow, corrosive power of time. Sullivan snapped the left latch upward. It gave way with a heavy, metallic snap. The right latch followed suit. He gripped the heavy lid and heaved it backward. The rubber gasket, perfectly preserved, peeled away from the lip with a suctioning pop. Sarge shoved his snout into the open crate, took a deep sniff, and sneezed violently. He backed away, entirely disinterested in the contents, choosing instead to curl up on a moth-eaten wool blanket near the glowing kerosene lanterns. Sullivan stared down into the box. His cynical, weathered mind simply refused to process the geometry for a long moment. He had expected survivalist staples, water purification tablets, freeze-dried rations, maybe a cache of ammunition. Instead, the footlocker was perfectly partitioned into neat, heavy rows of dull, gray metal. He reached out and picked one up. The weight of it immediately strained his wrist. It was a rectangular bar, roughly the size of a thick paperback book, but it weighed over 6 pounds. The surface was slightly tarnished, lacking the brilliant, polished luster of a museum piece, but the stamped lettering on the face was undeniable. 100 TROI ounces, .999 fine silver. Sullivan ran his calloused thumb over the raised lettering. It was real, cold, heavy, and absolute. He did the brutal math of his life in a matter of seconds. 30 years of hard labor, a shredded knee, a divorce that had stripped him down to the copper wire, and a credit score effectively erased by predatory collection agencies. All of it had left him standing in the freezing rain with absolutely nothing. Now he was holding a solid block of financial leverage. He placed the bar back into its slot and began counting the rows. 10 bars across, 5 bars deep, 4 layers down, 200 bars in total, 20,000 ounces of silver. Even at a modest market rate, the value sitting inside this single metal box was enough to alter the trajectory of his existence permanently. But the survivalist hadn't stopped at precious metals. Tucked neatly beside the stack of silver was a heavy, vacuum-sealed plastic bag. Sullivan pulled his pocket knife from his belt, flicked the blade open, and sliced through the thick polymer. The bag split open, releasing a faint smell of old ink and dry cotton. Bundles of cash, mostly 20s and 50s, bound tightly in brittle rubber bands that snapped into dust the second Sullivan touched them. They were older bills, the designs predating the heavy security updates of the early 2000s, but they were perfectly legal tender. It was untraceable, anonymous liquidity. Sullivan sat back on his heels. The silence of the bunker was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy breathing of the German shepherd sleeping near the lanterns. A bitter, humorless laugh climbed up Sullivan's throat, echoing off the concrete walls. The judge who had sneered at his financial records. No, the ex-wife who had systematically changed the locks and emptied the joint accounts. The bank manager who had treated him like an insect because he couldn't meet the minimum payment on a predatory loan. They were all up there in the world above, navigating their neat, structured lives, completely unaware that the man they had discarded had just fallen through the floorboards into independence. "Looks like we're not sleeping in the mud anymore, Sarge," Sullivan said quietly. The dog lifted his head, thumped his tail twice against the concrete floor, and rested his chin back on his paws. He didn't care about the silver. He didn't care about the vindication. He just cared that his master was there and that the freezing rain was gone. Sullivan stood up, his knee protesting a little less violently now that the damp chill was retreating from his bones. He began to systematically inventory the rest of the bunker. He found a crate of military-grade MRS that were surprisingly still sealed and viable. He found a first aid kit stocked with surgical tools, heavy antibiotics, and burn creams. On the top shelf, behind a row of empty jerry cans, he located a small, perfectly maintained propane camp stove and 3 green cylinders of fuel. Within 20 minutes, Sullivan had a small aluminum pot of bottled water boiling over the blue flame of the stove. He tore open a packet of freeze-dried beef stew, dumped it into the boiling water, and stirred it with a plastic spoon. The rich, savory smell of rehydrating meat and sodium filled the small room. Sarge was instantly awake, sitting rigidly by Sullivan's side, a string of drool hanging from his jowl. "Patience," Sullivan murmured, pouring a generous portion of the steaming stew into a clean plastic container. He set it on the floor and blew on it until the steam dissipated. Sarge attacked the food with ruthless efficiency, licking the plastic clean under a minute. Sullivan ate his own portion slowly, sitting on the edge of a canvas cot he had pulled from the corner. He ate in the amber glow of the kerosene lamps, feeling the heat radiate through his damp clothes, driving the shadow of death away. He looked at the open footlocker. The silver gleamed faintly in the low light. It was enough to buy a plot of land up in Montana or Wyoming, somewhere far away from suburbs, HOAs, and mahogany doors that clicked shut in the rain. Somewhere where a man could build a cabin with his own 2 hands and let his dog run off-leash without a neighbor complaining. Sullivan pulled the heavy wool blanket tightly around his shoulders. For the first time in years, the crushing weight in his chest was gone. The storm raged violently against the dead trees and ruined stone high above them, but down in the deep earth, the discarded veteran closed his eyes and finally found peace. Sullivan lost everything to a broken system, but loyalty and a little luck gave him the ultimate second chance. If this story of survival and payback hooked you, smash that like button. What would you do if you found an underground bunker loaded with silver? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a gritty comeback, and subscribe for more intense, grounded storytelling. See you in the next one.